Yes, I had been in the department for about 8.5 years, and the African Bureau, which is a large part of the State Department, if you include the embassies overseas, thousands of people are somehow part of the African Bureau. And 99% of them are career people or local hires, Anyway, the incoming Assistant Secretary for Management, or Undersecretary for Management, asked me this question: Chet, we hear that you get along with Foreign Service officers. What's your secret? And I said, well, you can always try taking one to lunch. In my experience, the people in the career service like to be part of success. And if they see the possibility of success and believe in what's being attempted and what's being stood up as an initiative, there is no more loyal and determined and committed bunch than the career Foreign Service. Obviously, if they have another view and don't think something's going to be very effective, they might be more inclined to distance a little bit. But in my experience, we couldn't have done what we did in the 1980s in Southern Africa without, in fact, across all of Africa, without the career service. Well, I'd been in government before in the National Security Council staff, actually, during the Nixon-Kissinger period. But I was tapped by Al Haig to do the transition on Africa, and then nominated by President Reagan to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, a political appointment. It took over 6 months to get confirmed because Republicans in the Senate weren't so sure that they thought I was the right kind of Republican. In any case, that's how I got involved. Yes, the policy of constructive engagement was designed to provide a framework for political solutions and political transitions throughout Southern Africa. It meant engaging with all those who would engage with us. That included South African government, all the governments of the region in Southern Africa, and any of the opposition movements that we could make contact with who would talk to us. So engagement meant working with all the parties for political ends, political solutions. We focused a lot of our attention on the regional conflicts at the time, trying to dampen down the regional conflicts over Namibia's independence, over the security of borders between South Africa and its neighbors in Mozambique and Botswana, Zimbabwe, Angola, and so forth. So we had this was a regional policy. But obviously South Africa was the centerpiece of it because South Africa was the regional hegemon. Well, in my view, the policy created a framework that got foreign troops out of all the countries in Southern Africa and provided the basis for Namibia's transition to independence. We got the Cubans out, we got the South Africans out. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, there were no foreign troops left in Southern Africa by 1991-92. So I think it worked. And eventually, most of the people who were involved, whether they were in the frontline African states or in Havana or in Moscow or in Europe or in South Africa, came to see it as a framework for success and for transition. Well, the apartheid government, which basically became, to meet that description in the late 40s, early 50s, was a government based on a racial doctrine of trying to keep everybody separate. So apartheid actually means separate development. That's the proper English definition of apartheid, which is more or less of a Dutch word or an Afrikaans word. But it meant white minority rule, it meant oppressive rule, it meant very, very draconian police operations, it meant passed laws that prevented people of color from coming into the urban areas unless they had a permit to do so. It was a very repressive system, and it was a doomed system. And during the 1980s, more and more and more people of every background came to recognize that it was doomed, including people in the government, but they were unsure how to get from here to there, to liberate themselves from the intellectual and political prison they had created for everybody. Well, I think there comes a point where no matter who you're working with, whether it's an authoritarian group or a military dictatorship or a democracy, if you're asking that other party to make decisions that might be tough decisions, you have to respect the fact that they've got to carry their constituency with them. And so that's one reason why it's important. You also have to make sure that, and this was particularly true in South Africa, that the local government is not defining what your policy is for the local population. And at the time, during the final years of apartheid, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, had a habit of defining constructive engagement as an alliance with them, which of course was not the point. And we had to undercut that, and we had to undercut their effort to undercut us, in a sense. So it was, a lot of public diplomacy was required. Well, the first step would have to be, and was, the winding down of the regional conflicts surrounding South Africa. South Africa would never have had a negotiated soft landing if it was still engaged in cross-border warfare with what it saw as a total onslaught backed by Moscow. That just wasn't going to happen. So the first step, and we had this view reinforced in our conversations with many of the frontline African leaders, the first step is to stop the regional wars and to get them settled. After that, it would become more and more obvious that South Africans had to come together and shape their own destiny at the negotiating table. No one was going to win the South African conflict in the battlefield, and no one did. The whites didn't lose, and the African National Congress didn't seize power. It was a negotiation. Well, really, since the end of the Cold War, the barriers to entry have collapsed when it comes to diplomacy and negotiation and mediation. And so you see more and more people go into that profession, if you like, or that line of work, whether they are retired eminent persons like Jimmy Carter or Marty Ahtisaari of Finland, former president of Finland, or whether they're a sort of track two organizations like Search for Common Ground right here in the US, which is all over the world. You see a lot of non-official efforts by different kinds of organizations. You also see regional bodies like the African Union or the Arab League or the OAS getting involved, as well as the United Nations. So it's not just the diplomacy of major powers or of states that is involved. It's more and more people doing this. And it means that you sometimes wonder if there's any kind of a clearinghouse or gatekeeping that can go on so that you can build coherence. Because without coherence, you can't get negotiations to work. So it's quite often, I'll tell you a little story. When Kofi Annan was asked to negotiate the end of the conflict in Lebanon in 2006, his basic response was, between Israel and Hezbollah and so forth, his response was, yes, as long as I'm the one doing it. If everybody else is going to do it, why, go talk to somebody else. That was a good answer. I got to know Ed Perkins in a number of capacities. He was the director of the Office of West African Affairs, which is a huge office in terms of its geographic reach within the African Bureau. He was also our ambassador in Monrovia, Liberia, for a number of very difficult years, dealing with a very difficult regime there during the 1980s. So I had a chance to see him in action. I had some real experience with the guy. We knew each other. We sort of understood each other's body language and how we communicate and stuff. So it was a good fit. And it was obviously when the time came to respond to the idea of sending an African American ambassador to South Africa, he was on the very short list, and he was at the top of mind. I think the core of it was to send a message, yes, but to send a message a proud message of who we are and of who you could be to the South Africans. Yes, but also we wanted to make sure that we were sending a person of professionalism, of experience, who would have the the capacity to do the kind of systematic all points outreach which Ambassador Perkins did when he got there in, I think it was November of '86, yeah. I would say it depended completely on which South African. South Africa was a very complex society, it still is, and the answer to that question would depend on who you talk to. But Ed Perkins is not somebody who speaks in long-winded pages and pages and pages. He gets to the point and he makes his points, and he's quite direct. And he would make his points in public without sticking his finger in people's eyes. He made his point very, very clear to the multiracial audiences of South Africa. But he also made his points in private meetings to different constituencies. Constituencies within the government, constituencies within the different elements of the ANC alliance, and so forth. Not enough. There are a lot more today. It's taken time for the Foreign Service to become representative of America's ethnic and gender diversity. It's made a lot of progress, but there weren't that many African American officers of senior rank at that time. I'm not well briefed on his security detail from day to day while he was down there, but I'm sure that he made certain that he knew if there were threats, and that he had good people advising him if there were threats. It was a messy time, not necessarily because of planned action, but because of spontaneous things that were bursting up all the time in the urban areas. The black urban areas of South Africa were sort of a low-level combat zone from one day to the next, and you wouldn't know where there were going to be necklacings, which was a way that black leaders sometimes imposed discipline on their own people, and it was not pretty to watch. And then you'd see the white police coming in and knocking heads and beating up kids and using rubber bullets and sometimes real bullets. So it could be, if you wanted to bear witness by visiting the black townships, you better be sure you know what the situation on the ground is, as I experienced more than once, and he experienced, Ambassador Perkins, many times. Well, his message was essentially that you cannot tell a disenfranchised majority who represents them, who speaks for them in an ultimate negotiation. So it was an inclusive message, which implied to the government, you need to be talking to the most legitimate people in the black community, and some of those people are free, and you can talk to them. They're right here, and some of them are on Robben Island. Some of them are in exile, and you have to reach out. The interesting part of that story is, as we now know, that the white government of the day was in fact doing some of that, whether it's because they'd listened to Ed Perkins or listened to Ronald Reagan, or whether it's because they saw the wisdom of it and did it for themselves. But that was a good part of his message. I think another part of it was that there are solutions to problems like this. This doesn't have to become a bloodbath. And having lived the American experience, I think Ed Perkins could speak with some credibility on that point. Well, I think of our Foreign Service as an under-resourced and highly talented service, which, well, sometimes people ask if I miss my government service. I had my share. The 1980s were an interesting experience. I lost all my hair during the 1980s, and it became a time when I'd have to see my children by appointment because I was working 7 days a week. People ask if I miss the State Department. My answer was, I don't necessarily miss the process of testifying on the Hill or preparing budgets. You miss the people. The people are spectacular. It's one of the most talented collections of human beings you'll find anywhere. and they were a delight to work with. And I learned so much, so very much from them. One lesson I learned was that you get much further working within the State Department if you surround yourself with the best people you can find, people who know more than you do. That's the way you get ahead. That's the way you succeed. But unfortunately, there's also a contrary instinct on the part of newcomers who come in the first time. Who can I trust? Are any of these people going to agree with us? Kind of thing. That kind of mentality has to be put to one side. You got to work with the Foreign Service because they are a strategic asset for the United States of America. I think the Foreign Service in general, at least from my own experience, is pragmatic and interested in results. I didn't see that many raving ideologues. I never asked people, who did you vote for? It wouldn't surprise me if there's a substantial percentage of Democrats in the Foreign Service. What that percentage is, I haven't a clue. And I think basically that there's also an interest in success, in what works. It's kind of, do these people coming in from outside, a new administration, do they have a clue? Do they know what they're doing? And how can we help them? How can we help them become more literate, more aware of the way diplomacy actually works? And so there's something really very, very American about the American Foreign Service. We're a can-do country, and I think the Foreign Service is a can-do bunch of people. There's different kinds of mediation. People who work in this field will talk about pure mediation, which implies impartial and unbiased, with having no interests. That's one kind of mediation. The other kind is called power mediation. And sometimes it's not so much that you use force, but that you're a powerful actor. And therefore the other parties that you're mediating with respect the fact that you are a powerful actor. And they might want to cooperate a bit more because they sense that perhaps it would be smart to do so. I'm sure that's why in the end of our experience in Southern Africa that the Cubans cooperated with us and made a decisive difference in bringing their Angolan friends along to the settlement that we had been proposing for the last 8 years. Because the Cubans may have thought this would be a payoff. Well, they had to wait until the Obama administration's second term to get the payoff, but anyway. It eventually might be coming. Well, we worked together by talking in great detail in Washington before he went out to post, by working together electronically through through telegrams and through phone calls on the green phone or the regular phone with regularity. And of course, he would come home on consultations from time to time, which made it possible to have face-to-face communication, not just with me, but with the Bureau of African Affairs, which has a large office of Southern African Affairs and a lot of people working on his mandate, his mission, sort of 24/7. Well, the South African president at the time, P.W. Botha, was a fellow out of central casting in the Hollywood sense. He was tough, he was direct, he was blunt, and I can't comment on the experience that Ambassador Perkins had when he first met. I suspect it was pretty chilly. The last time I had a meeting in P.W. Botha's office, normally when somebody comes to your office, you greet them. You walk towards them and you put out your hand. He didn't do that. He stayed in his side of the room and looked at me and said, "Mr. Crocker, why are you here?" So it was a little frosty. And I wouldn't be surprised if Ambassador Perkins had some similar occasions like that with some of the hosts in the host government.